In the late 1940s, a man calling himself J. Frank Dalton made a startling announcement. Said that the outlaw Jesse James had not been killed by Bob Ford in 1882. According to Dalton, the entire thing was a hoax, one orchestrated with the help of Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden. And Dalton knew all of this because he himself was the real Jesse James. What's more, he had evidence to back it up. Not only did Dalton's body bear the scars of over 30 bullet wounds, but he also obtained signed affidavits for people swearing that he and Jesse were one and the same. Sound familiar? Even the notorious train robber Al Jennings vouched for J. Frank Dalton. But how credible was Al Jennings? And just how well does Dalton's story stand up under scrutiny? Did he really have evidence, or was he just Brushy Bill Roberts 2.0? And if he wasn't really Jesse James, then who in the hell was he? And yes, we will also be discussing the infamous Jesse James DNA test. My name's Josh, and this is a very frustrating, but hopefully at least somewhat eye-opening episode of the Wild West Extravaganza. I would stick around to the very end because we'll also take a look at whether or not Jesse James was a dope fiend. Yeehaw! J. Frank Dalton is a mystery. We don't know his real name, we don't know where, when he was born, who his parents were, or virtually anything about his early life. Or the vast majority of his life, for that matter. Dalton really doesn't even pop up on the radar until 1947, at which point he was living in a tent in the slums of Austin, claiming to be a 90-something-year-old veteran of Quantrell's Raiders. It wasn't until the following year that he moved to Oklahoma and started talking about being Jesse James. And believe it or not, his story did gain traction. Dalton even began making appearances at various carnivals and fairs. Or at least he did, until the real James family filed a lawsuit. Consequently, the speaking engagements dried up and Dalton was dropped by his manager. That's when Frank Hall swooped in. Frank had previously worked for the Lawton-Constitution, same paper that broke the news about Dalton being Jesse James. And well, I reckon Hall smelled an opportunity. Either that or he truly believed in Dalton's stories. Just not for very long. Much like the previous manager, Hall called it quits after a relatively short period and pawned the old man off to a guy by the name of Lester Dill. And yes, this is the same Lester Dill who owned and operated Merrimack Caverns over in eastern Missouri. Lester, by the way, also invented the bumper sticker. I'm not making that up. Dude was apparently a genius when it came to promotions. In 1948, he even got his son-in-law Rudy to climb the Empire State Building in a caveman outfit and threatened to jump off if everybody in the world didn't visit Merrimack. And by 1949, Dill and Rudy were using J. Frank Dalton to promote the caverns. Sort of like a living tourist attraction. Not only could you visit a hideout used by Jesse James, allegedly, but you can also meet the infamous bandit in the flesh. Hell, they even celebrated one of Dalton's birthdays right there at Merrimack. Be that as it may, by September of 1950, J. Frank was back in Texas and dead broke. And by August of the following year, he was just plain dead. He was buried in Granbury, Texas, and to this day, the name on his tombstone reads Jesse Woodson James. Now, I really struggled with how to present all this information. If you're a new listener, I've also done a lot of work on Brushy Bill Roberts, the guy who claimed to be Billy the Kid. And I initially figured I'd give Dalton a similar treatment. But to be completely honest, I just don't have the patience, wherewithal, or bandwidth to do yet another deep dive on yet another Old West fraudster. I can sit here for the next hour and point out all the obvious flaws in Dalton's story, like the fact he originally claimed to be U.S. Marshal Frank Dalton, older sibling to the notorious Dalton gang. And when that didn't pan out is when he switched to saying that he was Jesse James. I can point out all the times he failed to answer simple questions regarding the real Jesse, like the full name of his brother Frank, or which arm his mother lost to the Pinkertons, or how his affidavits were suspect at best, and included someone who also signed an affidavit back in Brushy Bill Roberts. And then, of course, there's Dalton's other stories. Much like Brushy Bill, he couldn't stop at just one lie. Had to keep piling them on until he lost all semblance of credibility. You see, in addition to being the most famous outlaw of all time, Dalton also claimed to have been a high-ranking member of the super-secretive Knights of the Golden Circle. Said he provided Gatling guns to the Native Americans, and that's how come they were able to defeat Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. I am not joking. It's not just one of those things I made up. That's really what Dalton said. According to him, they placed the Gatling guns on the backs of mules. Then again, he also said he could travel the world using astral projection. Yeah, astral projection. I think I actually got that once after eating Taco Bell. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I could go on and on with this guy. For instance, Dalton also claimed to have killed John Wilkes Booth in Oklahoma in 1902. Said he worked as a mercenary in Africa and South America, and that he rescued Emperor Maximilian down in Old Mexico. He also swore up and down that he had been a pilot in the Canadian Army during World War I. I don't know about you, but I did not have Jesse James being a goddamn elderly fighter pilot on this week's bingo card. He was also a billionaire, by the way. According to Dalton, he had been an early backer of Howard Hughes, Henry Ford, and even the Wright brothers. And that's not to mention the numerous ranches, mines, brickyards, lumberyards, river steamers, and ocean freighters he also claimed to own. And of course, there is absolutely no evidence backing up any of this. All the discrepancies and contradictions are merely explained away by introducing a mysterious cousin, one whose name was also Jesse James. Once again, I have to reference Brushy Bill Roberts. Keep in mind that Dalton and Roberts were friends IRL. IRL is how the kids nowadays say in real life. And it really is truly amazing how their stories just sort of blend together, even right down to the cousin with the same name. Simply put, J. Frank Dalton was full of shit. Just another phony in a long line of phonies. But hey, if you're still not convinced, I've got some great news. You see, science has already solved the mystery for us. Yay, science! Right? I mean, science has solved the mystery, hasn't it? Hasn't it? False. It has not. At least not conclusively. And that's what I really wanted to talk to you about today. The so-called DNA test that supposedly proved that Jesse was killed in 1882. Look, I'm going to level with you here. This is going to get a little confusing, and it's also going to be a little shocking. I've heard rumors, but I had no idea it was this bad. And I think you'll understand what I mean here in just a moment. But first, a little backstory. You see, Jesse James was initially buried at his mother's farm in April of 1882, and it's there where he stayed for the next 20 years. It wasn't until 1902 that his body was exhumed and reinterred next to his wife at the Mount Olivet Cemetery, just a few miles from the original gravesite in the town of Kearney. Sounds like a relatively simple affair, but there were complications. First off, it was raining cats and dogs when they dug Jesse up. Then, as they were lifting the casket, the bottom gave out, causing the remains to spill back down into the grave, including Jesse's skull. It actually rolled back into the grave twice before they managed to get everything transferred to a new coffin. Worth noting that Jesse's son, Jesse Edwards James, aka Jesse Jr., was in charge of the exhumation. That being the case, he was able to inspect that runaway skull. And according to him, there was a bullet hole behind where one of the ears should have been, about the size of a quarter. He also recalled how his father's hands were still, quote, folded over the breast, just as they had been placed 20 years earlier. These remains were then taken to the new cemetery by former Quantrill raiders and reburied. According to Nancy B. Samuelson, in an essay titled Who is Buried in Jesse James's Grave, there was, quote, no evidence that the coffin was left unattended at any time before reburial, end of quote. By the way, before I forget, if you're currently watching this on YouTube, I did release a video last week all about the death of Jesse James, but I accidentally released it 12 hours early. I know a lot of people missed it, so if that applies to you, please feel free to check it out when we're done here. I'll even put a link down below. Okay, so in October of 1978, there was another excavation there at the original gravesite, conducted by Clay County's Dr. Milton F. Perry and archaeologist Dr. Robert Bray. And they were able to locate a number of very interesting artifacts that had been left behind, including bits of the old casket, teeth, a few pieces of hair, bone fragments, and even a .36 caliber ball. Several of these samples were sent to Kansas State University for analysis, and the results do back up the traditional narrative. The good folks over at the osteology lab determined that the remains almost certainly belonged to a Caucasian male, around 38 years of age, who had been dead for about 100 years. Not too far off, right? Jesse was actually 34 when he was killed, and he had been buried for 96 years as opposed to 100, but still, that's pretty damn impressive. At least it is, assuming that everything was done on the up and up. But unfortunately, that does not seem to be the case. I'll give you a for instance. The doctor who tested the items at the university determined that Jesse's teeth showed signs of a prolonged fever. Okay, fine. I'm sure he had more than a few prolonged fevers throughout the course of his life. especially considering how many times he was seriously wounded. But regrettably, said doctor then fabricated a story about some fake probate records to back up his hypothesis. Maybe he meant well, I don't know. Maybe the teeth did show signs of hypoplasia. But why make up a story? Why not just stick with the results, come what may? By the way, I'm saying all of this with the full realization that I do not know the entire story, nor do I have the doctor's side of the story. It could very well be that I'm misunderstanding a few key details. I just want to make that very clear. I did reach out to the guy, at least a professor at that same university, with the exact same name, who I think is the doctor who tested the remains, but as of this recording, he has not yet replied. I also have not personally reviewed those probate records in question. I cannot stress how hard it was finding reliable information on what we're discussing today, the excavation and the exhumations. So please verify and double check everything that you hear me say. And if by some chance you happen to have some insider knowledge, maybe if someone you know or even if you were involved, please feel free to hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com. I am very open to being corrected. Now, that good doctor's indiscretion or alleged indiscretion notwithstanding, I really don't have any other reasons to doubt the results. And I also think it's pretty cool that their analysis strongly supports the historical narrative of Jesse being killed in 1882. That said, there was additional tomfoolery involved. The guy in charge of the dig, Dr. Milt Perry, actually started handing out the artifacts like souvenirs. Now, the rest were put on display in the museum, and eventually a few of the pieces were placed in a Tupperware bowl and reburied. Once again, not necessarily a hanging offense, but it also doesn't give me a lot of faith in Dr. Perry's professionalism. And I say that as if I even have an iota of his accolades. Look, I barely graduated high school. I have a total of 0 degrees. By contrast, Dr. Perry's credentials are a mile long. This guy was a legit historian. And in addition to his work there in Clay County, he also served as the first curator for the Truman Library. So while I don't necessarily love the idea of Dr. Perry handing out valuable artifacts to his buddies, part of me feels like he had to have at least known what he was doing regarding that excavation. This is not me knocking Dr. Perry, or even that doctor at the university. All I'm trying to do is share the full story, so far as I understand it, which, to be honest, ain't much, mostly on account of a lack of transparency. Once again, please double check everything I'm saying and feel free to reach out with any corrections. Now, as many of you already know, Jesse was dug up yet again at the Mount Olivet Cemetery in July of 1995, this time with Professor James E. Starrs at the helm. Much to the professor's dismay, however, they only had a couple of days to exhume the body. And then, further complicated matters was the condition of the casket. Just like the original coffin, it too had nearly disintegrated. In other words, they couldn't just simply dig down with a backhoe and fetch up the body fully intact. Instead, once they uncovered what was described as shards of decaying wood, the operation turned into more of an archaeological dig. And according to Professor Starrs, it was handled professionally. Quote, working from the westernmost part of the grave pit nearest the headstone, Dan Kaizen ploddingly and conscientiously exposed several artifacts. Then he turned up badly decayed skeletal remains. My daughter-in-law, Tracy Starrs, was carefully recording each artifact that he turned up. Uncomplaining and conscientious, she sat right by the grave pit in the hot sun, ensuring that the process was done correctly and that all retrieved items were documented. End quote. The team was able to locate another .36 caliber ball near what they thought was Jesse's right rib cage. They also found 16 teeth, some of which contained gold fillings, which Jesse's son had also noted back in 1902. They were even able to reconstruct the skull and determine the presence of lead, indicating a gunshot wound. So far so good, right? The only thing left was to extract DNA. And turns out that's not as simple as it sounds. First, they tried the bones, but when that didn't pan out, they turned to the teeth. And that's when they hit pay dirt. Not only did they get DNA from a couple of the teeth, but they were able to compare the DNA to living James descendants. And surprising absolutely nobody, it was a match. Or as Professor Starrs put it, they had Jesse by science. Case closed, the end. The only thing is, not everyone's buying it. And believe it or not, I do think that the skeptics are somewhat justified in their doubts. You see, Professor Starrs returned a couple of months later and excavated the original grave site, the same one that Dr. Perry had dug up in 1978. Keep in mind that this was done after obtaining those teeth from the Mount Olivet Cemetery, but before releasing the DNA results. He also requisitioned several artifacts from the James Farm Museum, including teeth and a piece of hair allegedly belonging to Jesse James. And yeah, these are some of the same items that Dr. Perry discovered back in '78. This was not done with the express approval of the museum. But as Stars writes in his book, quote, "In the end, the James Farm relented and allowed us to take the hair from the James Farm Museum and test it. What Stars fails to mention is that the museum didn't relent until he obtained a court order, and to this day they have still not been able to retrieve those items. According to Stars, what destroyed during testing was just reburied." And if you'd like to hear what Stars has to say about any of this, just check out his book, Voice for the Dead. It is available for free on archive.org if you're interested. I'll even drop a link down below because I care, okay? I love you. That's why I'm going to drop that link down below. And I don't know. It's just getting creepy right now, so I'm just going to go along with the rest of the story. Now, if you don't mind, I would like to share Professor Starr's full statement concerning the DNA. Quote, "Stone King had tried getting DNA from the bones from the grave, but their decayed condition made that impossible. As a last resort, they turned to the teeth. Teeth have protected enamel coating, and inside that coating, the DNA is housed. So the enamel protects the DNA, and we had 16 teeth available to test. After one tooth after another tested out unsuccessfully, Stone King finally announced a match between two molars and the mtDNA of two known descendants of James's sister, Susan Lavinia James." End quote. And what follows is the official report published in the Journal of Forensic Science. The next 60 or so seconds is going to be a little boring, but please bear with me. This is some very important information, and it will all make sense in just a few minutes, I promise. Once again, this is the Journal of Forensic Science. Quote, "We report here that the results of the mtDNA analysis of remains exhumed in July 1995 from Mount Olivet Cemetery in Kearney, Nebraska, that are thought to be those of Jesse James." So right off the bat, they've already got the location wrong. It was Kearney, Missouri, not Kearney, Nebraska. Continuing on, quote, "The remains were poorly preserved, presumably due to wet and slightly acidic soil conditions, and insufficient DNA for analysis was obtained from two bone samples. However, 2 of 4 teeth and 2 hairs recovered in 1978 from the original burial site on the James Farm did yield reproducible mtDNA sequences. These mtDNA sequences from the teeth and hairs were all identical, suggesting that they came from the same individual. Furthermore, this mtDNA sequence was identical to mtDNA sequences determined from blood samples from 2 maternal relatives of Jesse James. Therefore, either the remains are indeed those of Jesse James, or they are from an unrelated individual who, by chance, happens to have the same mtDNA sequence. To assess the probability that an unrelated individual would have the same sequence, we searched the forensic mtDNA database and found that this sequence does not appear among the 2,426 mtDNA sequences therein. Hence, the mtDNA analysis supports the identification of the exhumed remains from Mount Olivet Cemetery as those of Jesse James." End of quote. And okay, maybe it's just me, but the way they worded that is a little confusing. It almost sounds as if the teeth that they got the DNA from were obtained from the museum as opposed to the Mount Olivet Cemetery. I'm going to read just that one line over again and tell me what you think, please. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy. Okay, so, quote, "However, 2 of 4 teeth, comma, and 2 hairs recovered in 1978 from the original burial site on the James Farm, comma, did yield reproducible mtDNA sequences." So, I don't know, I guess the comma sort of differentiates between the teeth and those items recovered from the farm. But then again, why did they say 2 of 4 teeth and not 2 of 16 teeth? Remember, according to Stars, they found 16 teeth at the Mount Olivet Cemetery. Could the 4 teeth being referenced here be the ones they took from the museum? And if so, how do we even know those were really the teeth of Jesse James? I know they said that the DNA from the hair also matched the teeth, which is great, but once again, was it the teeth from the museum or the teeth from the grave? And really, this is my biggest issue with this entire operation. Just the complete and utter lack of transparency. Pretty much everything I can find on these digs is almost purposely vague. I've been studying this shit for like over a month now. I've reached out to people who were actually there, and I still have no fucking clue where they got that DNA from. Now, we'll circle back to the DNA in just a moment, if my voice doesn't fucking give out on me, but I'd also like to highlight some of the other issues. One of which is that Jesse James was buried face down. Or at least he was, according to Professor Stars. Remember, it was Jesse's own son, along with one of Jesse's stepbrothers, who handled the remains in 1902. And at that time, Jesse Jr. did state that his father's arms were crossed over his chest, indicating, of course, that he was buried face up. But to hear Professor Stars tell it, by 1995, the corpse had mysteriously turned over. So unless Jesse James was literally rolling over in his grave, it just sounds to me like someone's lying. Unless, of course, they just haphazardly threw the remains in the new coffin back in 1902, but I kind of find that hard to believe. I also think that those former Quantrell men would have especially bristled at such an indignity. Or who knows, maybe Jesse requested that he be buried upside down so the entire world could kiss his rebel ass. Or hear me out, maybe, just maybe, Professor Stars dug up the wrong body. Speaking of dead bodies, one of the best ways to ensure that you yourself don't wind up 6 feet under is by having a well-balanced diet. Not the easiest thing to accomplish when you're like me and just constantly on the go. And that's where today's sponsor comes into play. Huel. New customers visit Huel.com/WildWest today and use my code WildWest to get 15% off your first order, plus a free gift. Now I know what you're thinking. What is Huel? Well, I'll tell you what it is. Huel, or more specifically Huel's Black Edition, is essentially a ready-to-drink meal in a bottle. Sort of like an MRE, only if MREs were liquid and delicious. And with 35 grams of protein and a whopping 27 vitamins and minerals in each and every bottle, Huel Black Edition is the perfect meal when you're on the go. And really, it's the proteins and the vitamins that make Huel such a perfectly balanced meal. Add the fact that it's designed by nutrition experts to help take the guesswork out of healthy eating. And it tastes good, okay? Like really good. Look, these types of drinks are usually hit or miss, but Huel truly does taste like a milkshake. It also comes in a wide range of flavors. My personal favorite is chocolate, because I am down with the swirl. Huel is high in protein, high in nutrients, low in sugar, and under $5 per bottle. What's not to love about that? I actually enjoyed a bottle earlier today for lunch. And guess what? New customers visit Huel.com/WildWest today and use code WildWest to get 15% off your first order, plus a free gift. One more time, that's Huel, HUEL.com/WildWest, and use my code WildWest to get 50% off your first order, plus a free gift. This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is also brought to you by ExpressVPN. Look, man, life can be a jungle. Me personally, when someone smiles at me, all I see is a chimpanzee begging for its life. And just like animal predators aim for the slowest prey, hackers target people with the weakest security. And if you're not using ExpressVPN, that means you. Every time you connect to an unencrypted network, whether it's at a hotel, at the airport, or even a coffee shop, your online data is not secure. Any hacker on that same network can gain access and steal all of your personal data, which they'll then turn around and sell on the dark web just to make a quick buck. But not with ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN stops hackers from stealing your data by creating a secure, encrypted tunnel between your device and the internet. And the best part is, ExpressVPN is extremely secure. So much so that it would take a supercomputer over 1 billion years just to get past the encryption. It's also very easy to use. Just fire up the app, whether it's on your phone, your laptop, tablet, or what have you. Click one button and boom, you are protected. And not even ExpressVPN can trace an IP address back to the user on account of an optional dedicated IP service engineered with innovative zero-knowledge design. I don't know what any of that means, but it sounds pretty fancy. ExpressVPN also comes with Identity Defender, a new suite of tools to get your data removed from data brokers, alert you when your data appears on the dark web, and even insures you against data theft for up to $1 million. That's a pretty good deal, which is probably why ExpressVPN is rated #1 by top tech reviewers like CNET and The Verge. I had to go out of town for a wedding last weekend. Ugh. And you better believe my laptop was protected with a VPN the entire time. And now you too can enjoy the same level of protection. Secure your online data today by visiting expressvpn.com/wildwest. That's expressvpn.com/Wild West. Find out how you can get up to 4 extra months free. expressvpn.com/Wild West. Now, I recently got my hands on a very interesting essay written by the aforementioned Nancy B. Samuelson and published in the now defunct National Association for Outlaw and Lawman History. I don't know much about the author, other than she wrote a book on the Dalton gang and another on the Three Guardsmen out of Oklahoma. She also appeared in the 1992 documentary Outlaws, 10 Most Wanted, and she is, or was, a contributing member to the Wild West History Association, of which I am also a member. And, well, let's just say that Nancy B. Samuelson was not very happy with Professor Stars. She even made the subtitle of her essay, "Why Can't James Stars Count Teeth?" Now, I will admit, much of what she wrote about is stuff that I would consider nitpicky. Like, she criticizes Stars for getting certain dates and names wrong. Sort of like how they got that location of the gravesite wrong in the scientific journal that I read earlier. I don't necessarily find these mistakes as damning as Samuelson does, but she does make a great point of saying that such mistakes show a lack of discipline and attention to detail. And I do sort of agree. If you're careless in the minor details, how do we know you'll be diligent when it comes to the important stuff? But then again, I too am guilty of making similar mistakes. How many times have you heard me get something as simple as directions wrong? I'll say that such and such town was 10 miles southwest of the border, when I really meant that it was northeast of the border. Doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the information isn't relevant or accurate, but I get what Nancy's saying. At the end of the day, it does point to a certain degree of carelessness. I like to think that if I was doing something as historically important as exhuming Jesse James, that I'd make doubly sure to dot my I's and cross my T's. A lot of her other concerns seem to be centered mostly around Professor Starr's somewhat unconventional personality, which was also highlighted in a particularly damning piece by journalist Amanda Ripley titled Bone Hunter. I'm not going to get into it here. I really don't think it matters all that much. But suffice it to say, Starr's reputation was not held in high regard amongst his peers, especially historians and anthropologists. I mean, the dude was even hawking t-shirts during the excavation. Shirts that read, "We dig Jesse." And this is not the only time the Starrs pulled such a stunt. He also sold t-shirts during a prior excavation in Colorado, when they dug up the victims of Alfred Packer. Samuelson also points out that Starrs initially received permission to exhume Jesse's mother, Zerelda, but he declined, instead opting to extract DNA from people with a somewhat questionable pedigree. Apparently, there are doubts as to whether or not those James descendants who were tested were truly James descendants. And by Starr's own admission, he deceived the judge who approved the exhumation. And then there's the fact that the number of teeth obtained from the grave is just constantly changing. In some reports, it says they only found a dozen teeth. Then it was 14. And finally, as late as February of 1996, Starrs claimed 16. The image in his book, however, only shows 14. And in a sketch made by one of his assistants, the teeth are nowhere to be seen. Mrs. Samuelson sums up her thoughts by writing, quote, "In summary, the information disseminated about this exhumation has been inconsistent, confusing, and unreliable." She also points out that Professor Starrs proved nothing, and that the project was characterized by faulty assumptions, false statements, sloppy record keeping, and a lack of proper scientific controls. End quote, amen, and pass the biscuits. I could not agree more. So I don't know, man. All that minor stuff aside, maybe I'm missing the forest for the trees, but just going off everything I've seen concerning this case, at no point do they make it clear where they obtained the DNA. And that's my biggest thing. They said they got it from the teeth, but which teeth? Was it the ones allegedly located at the Mount Olivet Cemetery? Or was it the teeth that Starrs took from the museum? And like I said earlier, if it was the museum teeth, then how do we know they even belong to Jesse James, not one of his siblings? Once again, I am more than willing to admit that I don't have all the information. Sadly, Professor Starrs is no longer with us, so I can't just call him up and get his side of the story. Same goes for Milt Perry. I did, however, find a statement from someone else involved, historian Phil Stewart. At least I think he was a historian. He was working at the James Farm Museum, though, at the time. And according to Stewart, the DNA test was legit. Quote, "Some say the tooth did not come from the grave. There is no doubt it did. The experts who were on the case are not going to jeopardize their reputations by falsifying information." End of quote. Also, according to Stewart, one of the femur bones found at the Mount Olivet Cemetery showed signs of a bullet wound. He also stated that the remains matched Jesse's physical description, a detail backed up by Dr. Mark Stoneking. And then, of course, there's the fact that they found a pistol ball and evidence of lead in the skull. I mean, what are the odds? They dug up the wrong body, who also just so happened to resemble Jesse James, both in age and build, and wounds. That said, I don't know how involved Stewart was with the actual dig, nor do I know how much of what he said was based on opinion versus fact. But luckily, I was able to speak with someone else who worked there at the James Farm Museum as the excavation was underway. I'm not going to reveal their name, but I got the feeling that they weren't all that happy with the way Stars conducted himself. But when I asked point blank if they agreed with Phil Stewart's assessment that the DNA test was legit, the answer was an unequivocal yes. The gist of the conversation, at least what I got out of it, was that while there were issues, the results were not fabricated. This person was also able to point out several false statements made by detractors. According to my source, the facts have been somewhat muddled, not only by the press, apparently it was a damn media circus, but also by people looking to profit off of phonies like J. Frank Dalton. For instance, earlier I mentioned how Professor Stars obtained a court order to get those teeth and the hair samples from the museum. Well, rumor has it that the deputy counselor for Clay County back in those days refused to hand over the hair. Instead, he simply cut a few locks off of one of his buddies, and that's what he gave to Stars. And it was that hair that Stars tested. According to my source, though, that never happened. While they were very familiar with the story, they were also very adamant that the hair sample was not taken from a living person. It was indeed the hair that was on display at the museum. The same hair, by the way, that Dr. Perry had located in the grave back in 1978. Or 79. Whatever. Now I'm the one getting details wrong. Okay, with all of that in mind, here's where I stand as of right now. I cannot, in all good conscience, reference this DNA test as proof that Jesse James was killed in 1882. Simply put, there's just too much confusion and not enough transparency. That said, my thoughts on the matter are very much subject to change. All I really need is just evidence proving that the tooth came from the Mount Olivet Cemetery. And I'd also like to see it tested against other known James descendants. I don't think that the exhumation was bungled on purpose, nor do I believe that it was part of some grand conspiracy to cover up the truth. There's an old saying, never attribute to malice what can be attributed to incompetency. If I were a betting man, I'd wager that the tooth probably did come from Jesse's grave there at the Mount Olivet Cemetery. I think Stars had a bit of an ego and he wanted headlines, and he was more preoccupied in selling t-shirts and making a name for himself than properly collecting and marking the samples. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he was a con artist. It just means that the dig wasn't correctly documented. At the end of the day, though, I just can't get past not really knowing where the DNA came from. That and Stars not releasing the results until after he got the teeth from the museum. If he already had what he needed from the grave, then why go through the trouble of getting a court order? But hey, luckily we don't have to rely on DNA at all, as there is a ton of historical evidence showing that Jesse James was killed by Bob Ford in 1882. Not the least of which are the numerous eyewitnesses, both friends and enemies. Keep in mind that Bob Ford and his brother Charlie readily admitted to what they had done, and who they did it to. They also testified at the coroner's inquest immediately following the murder. So did Jesse's wife, his mother, his son, and even Clay County Sheriff James Timberlake. And they all agreed that the body belonged to Jesse James. Hell, even Dick Little ID'd the body, and he was fucking terrified of Jesse. In addition to the witnesses, there was a post-mortem done by a Dr. Catlett and Coroner Hedens. And they both noted the bullet scars near Jesse's right nipple, as well as the missing tip of his finger. A few days later, the body was taken to Kearney and placed in a hotel, with the casket lid removed, so that folks could file past and pay their respects. Per an attendee, quote, "There were hundreds of people there, a number of relatives, among whom were his mother, wife, 2 children, and the Samuel children, who were Jesse's half-brothers and sisters. There were many neighbors who knew Jesse all of his life." End of quote. From there, the body was transferred to the same church where Jesse was baptized back in 1866, and then, following the service, he was laid to rest at his mother's farm. Important to note that St. Joseph, Missouri, where Jesse was killed, had a population of over 32,000 people in 1882, and Clay County, where Jesse was displayed and buried, boasted of over 25,000 residents. This was not like with Billy the Kid, where he was killed in a remote location with only a couple hundred people bearing witness. Damn near everyone who knew Jesse James, at least those within a 50-mile radius, saw his body lying in that casket. According to historian T.J. Stiles, there was upwards of 2,000 mourners. We also have visual proof. Once again, with Billy the Kid, right? Unlike Billy, Jesse was propped up and photographed. More than once. There are at least 2 photos still existing that show Jesse James plain as day lying in that casket. In other words, to paraphrase the great Old West historian Mark Lee Gardner, the assassination of Jesse James is one of the best documented deaths in American history. Now, it's my opinion that there really was no reason to begin with to dig Jesse up. The only real purpose I can think of for obtaining DNA would just be to appease a very small yet very vocal minority of conspiracy theorists, people who know very little about the actual historical evidence. And in that sense, the exhumation was an abject failure. All Stars managed to do was give the skeptics additional fodder for their crazy theories. Look, for Jesse's death to have been a hoax, somewhere around 1,000 people would have had to have been in on it, even those who hated him. First of all, they would have had to have killed someone else who looked enough like Jesse to prop him up in public and take pictures. And that someone would also have to have the same exact scars and wounds that Jesse incurred during the Civil War. Now, the skeptics will explain this away as people just lying to cover up Jesse's escape. But you gotta think, that only really works if everybody loved and adored Jesse James. Keep in mind that when James first began riding with Quantrell and Anderson, his first victims were his own neighbors. Long before he ever faced off against the Kansas Redlegs or the Yankees or the Pinkertons, Jesse was murdering people he had known for his entire life. People whose families continued residing in Clay County even after the war. They too saw Jesse's body, and they would have had zero reason to help cover up a hoax. Samuel Hardwick's a great example of this. He was so afraid of Jesse that he fled the state of Missouri entirely. But guess what? By 1882, he was right back there in Clay County. And I just do not see him lying in order to protect Jesse James. Same goes for the Ford brothers and Dick Little. And besides, if Jesse really faked his own death, that would also mean that he was okay with his wife and children suffering in poverty for a number of years. So to sum it all up, no, I do not think the DNA test is credible. But I also don't think that Jesse faked his own death. It's my opinion, and the opinion of every legitimate historian that I'm aware of, that Jesse James was killed by Bob Ford in 1882. All of the evidence points to this conclusion, and there's really not anything of substance to the contrary. Now, I started off by discussing J. Frank Dalton, and as crazy as this may sound, we still don't know his true identity. If I had to guess, though, I'd say he was most likely not 103 years old when he died, like he claimed. He was very old. You can tell just by looking at him. He was probably already well into his 90s. But I don't think he was old enough to actually serve in the Civil War, which might explain why he didn't file for a pension until the 1940s. Had to wait till he got old enough to look the part. And then there's the fact that he was associated with other known phonies like Brushy Bill Roberts and Ora Woodman. I know what you're thinking, though. Why don't we just dig Dalton up and extract DNA from him? That'll show everybody. Well, it just so happens someone already beat you to the jump. A used car dealer by the name of Bud Hardcastle. The only problem is he and his team dug up the wrong damn grave. Imagine that. Something about moving headstones or some such shit. They claim to have partially uncovered Dalton's actual casket in the process, but their request for a second exhumation had been denied. That was like 20 years ago, so who knows what'll ever come of it. I think going forward, if you must dig up any of these historical figures, first of all, I don't know, maybe go with somebody other than a used car salesman or some quirky professor. Also, you might want to consult with the historians first, okay? Not me, but actual real historians. Check with them and see if there's even a need to dig anyone up. What does the historical evidence say? And then, if you still want to go forward, I do think there needs to be some type of impartial panel that oversees the entire project. Like audit the process, take photos, make sure everything's properly documented, all that good stuff. Oh, and I don't know, maybe refrain from selling t-shirts. Because unless we do that, there's always going to be questions. I mean, there's going to be questions regardless, but this way we can give the crazies less to work with. And instead, we can focus on providing answers to people who are actually interested in history as opposed to fairy tales. And no, J. Frank Dalton certainly was not the only one claiming to be Jesse James. There were many other contenders, most notably a guy known as James L. Courtney. I really didn't dig too far into Courtney, but what little I saw involved Freemasons, buried Templar treasure, and of course the mysterious they that control everything. Just more conspiratorial nonsense. And look, man, I get it. It is way more fun to think about Jesse James being part of some all-powerful secret society and, I don't know, orchestrating all these historical events and getting one over on the law and spending the rest of his days laughing at his enemies. And it's also kind of fun to think about stumbling upon his buried treasure. Okay, I get it. But at the end of the day, I'm much more interested in the truth, whether or not something did or didn't occur. I mean, that's history, right? And to determine the truth, you must have evidence, real evidence, not just some story that someone on YouTube heard from their great-grandmother. Oh, and just in case you're curious, earlier I mentioned how that train robber Al Jennings vouched for Dalton. Well, a few years later, he finally came clean. When pressed on the matter, Jennings admitted, quote, "They paid me, so why not?" End of quote. And full disclosure, I too am open to bribes. If you want me to say that J. Frank Dalton or whoever was the real Jesse James, I will definitely do it. But my dignity comes with a price. And by price, I'm talking F you money, okay? Luckily, I do not have extravagant taste, so I really don't need all that much. Let's call it a small $2 million. That's Josh at wildwestextra.com. I eagerly await your best offer. Now, before we call it a day, as promised, I do want to discuss whether or not Jesse James was on drugs. First, though, I'd like to give a shout out to Scott McCrae. Scott just published his most recent book, Targets West, an exciting thriller that places American rancher Lucas Wheeler at the center of an international terrorist plot. Wheeler evades terrorists, government agents, and hired killers on 3 continents before the startling conclusion in London. And that conclusion is that he was the real Jesse James. Now, I'm just joking about that. Scott, by the way, is not just some amateur hack writer. The dude's already penned a total of 25 Westerns and was even a Spur Award finalist in 2024. You may have even seen him on TV, including Good Morning America. So if you love the Old West and a good thriller, I mean, who doesn't, right? Then you should definitely check out Targets West. Link down below and available on Amazon. Now, let's talk about Jesse James and his drug use. Someone asked me recently if Jesse was ever known to use opium. The closest I could find comes from the book Frank and Jesse James by Ted Yeatman. And according to Ted Yeatman, Jesse overdosed on laudanum in 1870 at his Uncle Haight's place over in Kentucky. Quote, "The Haight home had been a refuge for the James boys since after the Civil War. It was here in 1870 that Jesse overdosed on laudanum in what was later termed a suicide attempt, but probably wasn't." End of quote. And that's literally all I know about Jesse's drug use. I'm sure he did use stuff on occasion. He had to have been in chronic pain from all those wounds, so this revelation really doesn't come as that much of a surprise. But, that said, those hair samples from the James Museum were tested for narcotics. This was the hair allegedly taken from Jesse's original gravesite, and supposedly it tested clean. If that's actually true, which, let's be honest, by this point, who the fuck knows, then I think it's safe to say that Jesse didn't get loaded for at least the last few months of his life. And yeah, with that, I think we're about done with Jesse Woodson James. Sorry if it seems like I'm rushed today. I am very, 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 very busy, but I did want to get this out to you. And thank you so much for listening. There will not be a new episode next Wednesday, but I do plan on releasing a special announcement, so please keep your eyes and ears open. If you normally consume the Wild West Extravaganza on YouTube, the announcement will not be available on YouTube, okay? So you'll have to check in on Spotify or Apple or some other traditional podcast app. Or you can just sign up for the 100% free Wild West newsletter, because I will also post it there. Okay, until then, be nice and adios.